The Illusion of Growth in the Age of Podcasts and Influencers. I'm Ben Ufana, completing another in-depth article, so much detail, far more than I can remember, so for that reason, I will be reading directly from the article. There was a time back in the 1920s through the 40s when families gathered around the radio, listening together, whether it was a program like the Mercury Theater on the air, the evening news during World War II, or the fireside chats of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It was shared, communal, and it didn't take people out of their lives. Now, in our current age, it's striking to see how large shows like the Joe Rogan Experience, this past weekend with the Yvonne and mainstream podcasts like Call Her Daddy or Smartless have become. Much of what people are listening to is simply entertainment. It holds attention, fills time, but it's not asking anything of you, nor is it moving your life forward. More often than not, we're listening alone, in our cars, with earbuds in, moving through our day without ever sharing the experience with anyone else. The podcast world is extremely uneven. On one hand, there are mass appeal shows built on personality, reach, and entertainment. On the other, there are thousands of smaller podcasts where people process out loud, repeat similar ideas, or circle the same problems without depth or direction. Even in podcasts that focus on trauma, attachment, and mental health, much of it stays at the level of talk. There's insight, there's language, there's often a sense of being understood, but very little translates into real actionable change. It becomes discussion, sometimes even commiseration without resolution. For me, this new world of podcast has created a kind of tension. For many years, I worked in person in both individual and group settings. My work is deeply rooted in transformation, in actually changing how someone experiences themselves and their life. I used to do these classes on a weekly basis in New York City and every other week in Boston. People would show up, and often for the first time, I'd be seeing someone who had no idea what was going on with them, but I would guide people through practices, and I would adapt the practice to each person who showed up. And afterwards, I would scan their body and I would see and feel what was going on physically and emotionally, and I would relate back to them what I was seeing and feeling. And that's how I got most of my work. People would sometimes be blown away by the fact that I could pick up on what was going on with them, and it convinced them, like, wow, this guy could see what's going on, that I want to work with them. But anyway, in our current age, people are far less likely to show up in person, and it was declining over the years, but when we went into COVID lockdown, that really killed it. It got so much more difficult to get people to show up in person. The mindset has shifted. It's like, why go to the effort of attending something when you can just go online and listen and take it all in from a distance? The problem is so much is lost in that transition. Podcasts typically don't run on depth. They run on the question, will this episode perform? And when performance becomes the driving force, the conversation often gets shaped around attention, not transformation. Most podcasts and their hosts are rewarded for simplicity, personality, constant output, and increasingly for click-driven, emotionally charged, or controversial content. There's also a lot of oversimplification, complex issues reduced to sound bites that are often incomplete or simply wrong. So when I encounter shallow conversations and endless talking without movement, it feels like a total mismatch with what I know is actually required for real change. So many of us are consuming more, yet we're living less. We're learning about life rather than actually living it. We're scrolling and listening for hours on end, absorbing insight, hearing other people articulate truths we recognize, yet nothing fundamentally changes. We remain stuck. Ideas accumulate, but they're not taking root, and they're certainly not transforming us in any meaningful way. This steady diet of content feeds the illusion that we are growing when in reality we are simply becoming more informed observers of our own lives. That's not to say that there isn't a lot of valuable content online, because there is. When I was struggling with attachment wounds in my 20s, I was often at a complete loss because information addressing these issues wasn't nearly as available as it is now. There is value in seeking out what is relevant, yet continually filling your time and your head with podcasts and other forms of digital media no longer serves you when it prevents you from feeling, engaging, and being more fully present with yourself and others. My intention here is to challenge you to move beyond habitual consumption into real connection and into learning through direct engagement with other people and the world around you. Sometimes the shift can begin in very simple ways. You hear something meaningful, and instead of immediately moving on to the next podcast, the next video, or the next stream of information, you actually apply what you're taking in. Maybe you stop using screens an hour or two before bed and observe what happens to your sleep, your nervous system, and your overall sense of well-being over the next few weeks. Maybe you spend more time in silence. Maybe you begin having more direct conversations instead of retreating into endless consumption. This is how we begin developing a deeper relationship with ourselves through direct experience, reflection, observation, and genuine engagement with life. In many ways, podcasting serves three very different functions. There's entertainment. The audience comes for personality, for humor, distraction. It holds their attention, fills time, and depth is optional. There's sharing and processing. The audience comes to relate, to hear their experience reflected back to them. And there can be value in this, but it often stops short of real change. And then there's insight and transformation, which is much rarer. The audience isn't looking to just understand, they're looking for actual change. They are willing to engage more deeply, to apply what they're hearing, to feel and to do the work. These spaces do exist, but are much harder to find, and the demand is more for both the speaker and listener. On one hand, we're learning, we're taking in ideas, insights, and perspectives. We're becoming more aware and more informed. But on the other hand, many of us are not truly engaging with life in any meaningful way. We're not applying what we're learning, we're not living it, and in many cases, we're not even feeling what needs to be felt in order for anything to actually change. To be fair, many people are trying to apply what they're hearing with varying degrees of success, but without deeper engagement, without actually working through what's coming up internally, that effort often stalls. This isn't just about podcasts or influencers, it's about disconnection, avoidance, and the lack of real engagement with our own lives. Many people are consuming massive amounts of content under the belief that they're working on themselves, and to some extent that's true, but they're not stepping into the situations, and more specifically the relationships that would actually require them to change. We're not talking to people or putting ourselves in situations that require presence, discomfort, vulnerability, and response. As a result, we're not building relationships or developing ourselves through direct experience. Instead, we're filling that space with input, and over time, that input starts to replace something essential, real engagement with life itself. So what looks like growth on the surface can, in reality, become a subtle form of avoidance. Part of the reason podcasts and influencers have become so dominant is that many people are no longer engaging deeply, with those around them. There is less community, less shared experience, and fewer meaningful interactions. In that absence, these voices begin to fill a void. They create a sense of connection to other people, to ideas, and to what feels like participation in the world. In many ways, podcast culture has created a strange paradox. People can feel deeply connected to the voices they listen to regularly, while becoming increasingly disconnected from the people and physical world immediately around them. We're spending more time listening to voices in our ears than engaging with the people around us. As we listen to someone regularly, we become familiar with their tone, perspective, and personality. After a while, it can begin to feel personal, even deeply intimate, like connecting with an old, trusted friend. Yet, it's one-sided. There's no risk, no feedback, and no real interaction. The person we're listening to doesn't even know we exist. And as this becomes more normalized, our real-world connections begin to weaken. Conversations become less substantive. Community becomes nearly non-existent. Relationships become fewer and more distant. We're replacing real connection with highly curated audio experiences designed to inform and entertain, controlled, predictable, and lacking the depth, vulnerability, and uncertainty that real relationships require. Silence is essential. It is in quieter moments, without constant input, that we reflect, process our emotions, gain insight, and begin to understand what is actually happening inside us. But many people rarely allow themselves that space anymore. There is almost always something playing, another voice, another opinion, another distraction filling the silence. And when the mind is constantly filled with other people's voices, there's very little space left for our own. We begin following someone else's train of thought, absorbing their interpretations, and adopting their language without sitting with our own experience long enough to process it. As a result, there is little silence, reflection, or real digestion of what we're actually going through. So even though we may feel like we're learning, we're often integrating very little, if anything at all. It's important to understand that stillness, silence, and even boredom are not the enemy. They are often the doorway into reflection. When we stop flooding ourselves with constant information and stimulation, the mind naturally begins to wander, process, remember, imagine, and make connections. That is part of how we digest experience. Podcasts can become a buffer. They fill uncomfortable spaces, moments of boredom, loneliness, uncertainty, and silence, the very moments when we might otherwise have to feel what is actually happening inside us. And because this content may be intelligent, reflective, or emotionally resonant, it can be easy to miss the fact that we are still avoiding the deeper encounter with ourselves. Most people aren't doing this consciously. They're not thinking, I'm going to avoid my life by listening to podcasts. They're trying to understand, to grow, to find meaning and direction, but over time simply becoming familiar with psychological language, insight, and concepts can create the illusion that we are changing. We begin to recognize patterns intellectually and mistake that recognition for transformation. Insight alone, however, does not help us digest the emotional residue held in the body, nor does it automatically change the ways we relate, behave, and move through the world. Without real-world engagement, without stepping into discomfort, without actually applying what we're hearing, growth stalls out. And what replaces it is a cycle of listening, absorbing other people's perspectives, and assuming we're making progress. If you're like so many other people, you can continue repeating this cycle indefinitely. You can clearly see the dynamics I've been describing throughout this article playing out in certain spaces. Many men are spending hours listening to other men talk about women, attraction, and relationships, but they're not actually interacting with women in meaningful ways or learning through direct experience. They're learning about connection without participating in it. And without participation, nothing changes. And there's a flip side to this. Many women are also spending inordinate amounts of time consuming content about men, dating, and relationships. They're absorbing other women's opinions, rigid rules, frustrations, and emotionally charged narratives in ways that can begin to shape how they see men before any real interaction even happens. Much like the manosphere does for many men, these spaces can become echo chambers where fears, disappointments, defensive strategies, and generalized assumptions are continually reinforced. In some cases, this can lead women to develop a mindset shaped by accumulated narratives that is guarded and dismissive. A man approaches, and instead of curiosity or openness, there's immediate filtering, comparison, skepticism, suspicion, or mistrust. He's being measured against expectations, ideas, past interactions with other men, or accumulated narratives before there's even been a real exchange. In other cases, there's an emphasis on maintaining control, never appearing too interested, never being too available. On the surface, it can sound like empowerment, but taken too far, it can make genuine connection difficult. So just like many men are learning about connection without engaging in it, many women are entering interactions already shaped by what they've been hearing, rather than responding to the person in front of them. And as these narratives become more deeply reinforced, the gap between men and women continues to widen. Without real engagement, without presence, and without allowing something to unfold naturally, nothing changes. Part of this comes down to something deeper, a lack of direction, purpose, meaningful connection, and for many, underlying loneliness and uncertainty. Many people are profoundly disconnected from their own inner core. They lack the understanding or the kinds of practices that would allow them to develop that core, a strong internal foundation. Not knowing any better, they find themselves trying to fill that gap by relying on influencers, podcasts, and other forms of digital content to provide structure. These voices can create the feeling of movement, a sense that something is happening, but they can never replace the relationship we cultivate with ourselves, meaningful connections with others, a real engagement with the world. I'm not saying to stop listening altogether. There is value in many of these conversations. There are podcasts, books, interviews, and teachers that can genuinely help us better understand ourselves, other people, and the world around us. But consumption needs to become intentional. At some point, we have to turn the podcast off, sit with ourselves, and engage with the people around us and apply what we are learning in real life. We have to spend less time endlessly absorbing other people's thoughts and more time developing our own understanding through direct experience. That means having real conversations, building relationships, sitting with discomfort instead of constantly distracting ourselves from it, allowing silence, reflection, uncertainty, and genuine emotional processing to become part of our lives again, and for many to actually learn emotional processing for the first time. But anyway, insight can be valuable, but insight alone is not transformation. Real growth requires participation. It requires presence. It requires that we engage directly with life rather than remain observers of it. We're not only becoming disconnected from other people, we're becoming disconnected from ourselves. When that happens, it becomes easy to confuse input with growth. Very easy to mistake understanding for transformation. Very easy to spend years learning about life without actually living it. Real growth doesn't come from endlessly consuming information. It comes from engaging, feeling, and living your life directly.